there's either two reactions, right? You either put your head in the sand and hope it just never happens to you, or you become terrified of it and you do everything you can to ward it off. The reality is I think you have to embrace it. When it comes to time in terms of technology and disruption, you're much better off embracing it and try and be part of the solution. In fact, if you can disrupt yourself, all the better. I'm a big proponent of Clayton Christensen, the now past Harvard professor who always had the innovator's dilemma. Do you cannibalize yourself? But I think he was right. I think the underlying premise is correct, that industries that look inward and how they can reinvent themselves are usually the ones that come out and are the strongest.
Welcome to Canada Now. I'm Ashley Smith, and every week we dig into the bold ideas, real stories, and fresh perspectives shaping Canada's future. Let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to Canada Now, where we unpack some of the biggest, boldest ideas and some of the people helping move them forward to change Canada's future and move the needle. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Jeff King, someone who I do know personally, which we'll get into in a minute. Jeff is the CEO of the Greater Vancouver REALTORS. He has had a fascinating career. Before stepping into real estate, he led one of the biggest transformations in the music industry as COO at SOCAN, where he helped move the organization from tracking a few million music performances in a year to hundreds of millions in a day in the digital era. Since taking the helm here in Vancouver, he's been focused on how a profession steeped in tradition can embrace change, whether that's technology, data, or new ways of collaborating. Jeff's been recognized internationally for his leadership, but what stands out most is his drive to rethink old models and explore what's possible when industries face disruption. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today on Canada Now.
Thanks for having me, Ashley. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. For context for our audience, it's worth sharing that for those who don't know me, that I have a real estate background. I'm going to try to not spend this entire conversation actually talking about real estate. What I really want to talk about is transformation in industry. And I've seen it, having served on various boards in the sector in Canada and knowing a bit and being a little bit familiar with your role as CEO of a membership association. So that being said, you started a few years back here in Greater Vancouver as CEO, but you come from the music industry. And it's pretty unusual, actually, I think, for this sector to be inviting leadership from other arenas professionally. Why don't we start there? Tell me a little bit about where you came from.
Sure. You're quite right. I did something what most people do not do in their 50s, is I changed cities and industries. A lot of people will stick with the comfort, and for myself, I made a major transition. Part of my backstory is I was in financial services, reinsurance in the 90s, and was enjoying it and doing well, but was feeling somewhat unfulfilled. Through a variety of circumstances, including a death of a parent, I decided I want to do something where I could really make an impact, and for someone in their 30s was surprisingly legacy focused. And I ended up at SOCAN, which is the Society of Composers, Authors, and Music Publishers of Canada. When I arrived there in 2001, the revenue was around 121 million. You're right, they were doing 4 to 6 million transactions a year. But that, for the listeners, that was the period when Napster has just started to arrive. BitTorrent, Pirate Bay, all the rest were about to show up, LimeWire, Kazaa, you name it. And the disruption of the music and entertainment industry was starting. Now, it started in music, but movies and television were hit pretty quickly thereafter once broadband became commonplace. I'm quite proud of the work that SOCAN did to evolve in that time period. I'd like to think I had a part in that. And part of that evolution was the ability to handle data and to move towards a digitized economy, which clearly now in the entertainment space is entirely that. I was at SOCAN for about 20 years, and then in 2021, during the midst of COVID and all the rest of it, SOCAN sold off a couple of subsidiaries in the United States that we had purchased that did different things, but were kind of related to what SOCAN was doing. And then I realized, well, I don't want to just keep doing the same thing for the last chunk of my career. Maybe it's time to do something different, and started taking my resume for a test drive. When I was discussing this with the, at that time, RevGV board of directors, which is now Greater Vancouver REALTORS, it became pretty evident to me, both in my research and then talking to the folks, that real estate was an industry that was probably about a generation behind entertainment in terms of disruption and the shift. It doesn't mean it's a generation behind in terms of being worse or better. It's just different. the technology and the connections are just different, exposed in a different way. Similarly, travel agents and banking was feeling the revolution before entertainment. So nonetheless, I saw an industry that was about to be disrupted, and I thought, I think I can really help here. And this could be an interesting thing, and I can bring some of the learnings, some of of what other industries have gone through, and help guide real estate through this transaction and play a role in this evolution. Fast forward a couple of years. Firstly, I'm thrilled I was selected for the role, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And I think I'm contributing a lot towards not just GVR, but the industry in general and our role with the public. But also, I'm glad they thought outside the box and were comfortable enough to try something different. Like I said, I'm thrilled it was me, but I would have been hopeful it would have been someone like me or someone similar to perspective. Because when I look at my colleagues around the country, a lot of them are terrific. A lot of them are either lifetime real estate folks, longtime realtors, or longtime association people, and have never really gone through disruption. And so when you don't know about it, there's either two reactions, right? You either put your head in the sand and hope it just never happens to you, or you become terrified of it and you do everything you can to ward it off. The reality is I think you have to embrace it. And I've long have said that, when it comes to time in terms of technology and disruption, you're much better off embracing it and try and be part of the solution. In fact, if you can disrupt yourself, all the better. I'm a big proponent of Clayton Christensen, the now past Harvard professor who always had the innovator's dilemma. Do you cannibalize yourself? But I think he was right. I think the underlying premise is correct, that industries that look inward and how they can reinvent themselves are usually the ones that come out and are the strongest. And I read with great interest this past summer a report done by Protiviti, which is basically a management consulting firm. And they looked at a bunch of companies and found that organizations, associations, and Fortune 100 companies, you name it, ones that see themselves as disruptors tend to be. And the ones that do not see themselves as disruptors tend not to be. And it reminds me of that old Henry Ford quote, if you think you can or you can't, you're right. And if you think you can do it, odds are you probably could. And likewise, if you can't, you won't. British Columbia in particular is a very tech-forward part of North America, but there are some still areas that are surprisingly not embracing technology, and that includes part of real estate. I was somewhat surprised how paper-driven and email attachments and all this type of stuff the industry was when I arrived here. It's understandable, and that's a big challenge for the entire industry to overcome. But I think that's one of the big hurdles that will end up being the evolution in the second half of this decade that will move this industry forward. I'm convinced that people will always be involved in a transaction. A big part of my job is to make sure that person is a realtor, that it doesn't morph into some other model that other countries around the world do have. But those are the types of things that I'm seeing emerging rapidly in our disruption. Yeah,
it's funny, you mentioned rapidly, and having entered the real estate profession at an early age, I was pretty excited to lean into some of the technologies and innovations that were happening around that time, basically out of necessity, because I didn't have any money to, build my business in more traditional ways. But it has been surprising at how slow moving some of the change has been. And, you mentioned what felt, at least from a sort of consumer perspective, the music sector and the music industry and how we consume changed so fast. Just a fun anecdote. I'm not sure if I've shared this with you before, but I sort of came of age and saw this happen and, didn't know any better. I was young and didn't have any business experience, but I worked, for the Canadians listening, they might remember, but, my first high school job was at Music World in the mall.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so, I worked at several of these retail locations selling CDs, and I felt very cool. Again, throwback to the elder millennials and Gen Xers out there, like Empire Records kind of energy. And it was really fun. And they were busy. They were bustling. And then suddenly they weren't. And within 2-year period, they all closed. It went from having multiple storefronts of different competing, retailers in the same location to none. Yeah. And that happened very fast. And so when we talk about the pace of change and how it can, people that are in an industry can linger for some time and then suddenly things change. I'm just wondering, can we unpack that a little bit?
Sure.
What your thoughts are around how things can change all of a sudden?
Well, the one of the things I find is that the example you gave around Music World, and same thing happened to Tower Records and Blockbuster and others. Blockbuster kind of created an industry, the local video rental and things like that, and was destroyed within a generation. Like, I know there's one left. That's kind of like a boutique fun thing people do for nostalgia. But the reality is it was obliterated because of these changing things. And often I find with disruption, and it's happening in other industries, automotive and banking, they're going through similar disruptions. It feels like nothing's happening for a long time. And it's easy to say, well, nothing's happened for 100 years, so nothing will ever happen. But your experience, I think, is very apropos. Like with what happened with music was, I felt like nothing was happening for a long time. Some organizations went off and sued the grandmother in Minnesota because the grandkids were downloading songs and such. I think that was a poor strategy. Other ones embraced technology and said, what about global licensing? What about blanket licensing? You use entire repertoire, things like that, which turned out to be the right call. That ended up being the way that music is licensed now. But the pivot was incredibly rapid, and Spotify clearly was a big part of that. But there was other players in the middle of it, including Apple, with breaking apart the idea you had to buy a whole CD or a whole album for our older listeners here. But the idea you could just get the song you wanted and pay 99 cents, I know that morphed with time, but that was one of the big changes too. And that changed the licensing model. And all of a sudden, it felt like nothing was happening. Then everything happened. And in a space of 18 to 30 months, the world was turned upside down. And those are good lessons for us to sort of pay attention to. Part of the appeal of with real estate and with banking or in different industries like that is the personal connection. But the access to information is bigger than it's ever been before. I think agents are finding that they're being fact-checked on the fly, which was almost impossible a half decade ago. And then now you can be sitting at the cross kitchen table and they're pulling up listings and they're looking at different data feeds and they're doing their own comparison analysis and challenging some of the norms. So the need to provide value add is that much higher. I think it does mean that realtors that are using technology, including AI, mining tools, things like that, will be able to outcompete the ones that don't. And that is a seismic shift that we're starting to see happening. But it's not just in ours. I'm involved with a couple other folks in advisory roles around search and selling products online, digital products, things like that. And it's interesting to see the different challenges because you're dealing with a well-armed consumer. And I've said it 100 times. I co-authored an article with Trevor Coote not quite 2 years ago about how the consumer is undefeated. The consumer will find a way. And so like the travel agents in the 90s ran around with their hair on fire and tried to fight against and tried to protect their exclusive relationships with the airlines, with hotels. Eventually they lost. There's still a role for them, but if only for like large, complex corporate things, stuff like that. I think there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from it. And your own experience in that microcosm of music world, and oh my God, we're bustling, and where are we going to get our Led Zeppelin t-shirts and all that stuff? Eventually things shift. And then now to the point where you have people that can't imagine a life without ordering from Amazon. And all those types, and it becomes like the de facto way. But a generation ago, Amazon famously almost went broke a couple of times, right? And so there's going to be some bumps in the road as we go along. But I do think the disruption in several sectors across a number of different factors, like not just industries, but the whole political environment. A year ago, trade war was a distant thunder. Now it's here, right? Various litigations involve activist governments, the 51st state type of talk. All those things have sort of risen out of the ashes of what had gone on over the last 25 years. These are key factors for all industries, including real estate. And so we have to be, I think, very open-minded towards how to handle these types of things. One trend I've kind of noticed is that organizations, particularly individuals, that embrace a growth mindset seem to be able to outperform and adapt better. It's often said, Darwin said the biggest survivor ever. He never said that. He always said the ones that are able to adapt are the ones that survive, and the other ones don't. And it was, you can look at moths and industrial age London and being eaten by the birds because they weren't dark enough and things like that. But the scientific crux of it is right? You have to be able to adapt and deal with it and embrace it and not resist how these things evolve. I'm super passionate about it because I see it over and over again in multiple industries where people will try to dig in and fight for the old ways. And I think they're missing what could be huge opportunities. As a reminder, the music industry is now bigger than the movie industry, which it never was for the first 100 years of their coexistence. But movies have had their own things, the rise of streaming and all that type of stuff. So the shifts are here.
Yeah. And I mean, to your point, there's obviously implications for the individuals. So say the individual businesses, the individual practitioners within any sector. And of course, those who lean in, there's a lot of opportunity. But when we think about it more from I'm going to use the word macro perspective on, say, an entire sector. And now I'm thinking from a Canadian perspective specifically, and we'll use real estate as an example. If the way that it's been set up and the foundation, the framework for an entire sector that, serves a bunch of professionals that then serve, the public, changes that fast. I one of the things I think, sitting around a table late at night talking about where the industry might go a few years ago, the idea of like a Google or an Amazon or whatever might come in and find their own way of doing business here. But now I think that, to your point, as the geopolitical circumstances have changed, we're thinking more about data privacy, et cetera, et cetera. There's wider implications than just how a real estate professional might go and make their money. It's also about like, how's this industry going to run and how's the public going to be served and how do we make sure that they're protected all the while. And that Canadian industry in and of itself is not I hate to say taken over, but there's risk here. Yeah. And so I'm just wondering, do you think about these sorts of things when we're talking about how change is happening?
No, absolutely. And you've identified several distinct streams that are all kind of threads that are kind of all connected together. One a good one that I think Canadians are relatively mindful of around privacy and the security around those types of things. It's important, I think, for the real estate industry to keep that in the forefront and top of mind. That is one of the biggest differences between Canada and the United States, is a view towards digital privacy and such. And I've got a little bit of an anecdote, which I'll touch on in a minute. But those types of things is what helps breed confidence in the system from the consumer, which is for me a reason why things like a verified transaction or a digital deal room where the documents are sort of kept in one place. Not everyone can see everything, but the involved parties can see the relevant parts. Will be a huge lift forward for the industry, as opposed to me emailing you at ashley@gmail.com or handing you a piece of paper or those types of things, or vice versa, right? So I think that type of thing with that type of that level of security, to the extent, like the level like that banks rely on or Fortune 100 companies, things like that, I think that would be a huge boon for us. But the mindset towards privacy across the borders is much different. I kind of glossed over it a little bit in the intro, but for a time I was the CEO of the two subsidiaries, one in New York and one in Seattle, and had a good insight into how U.S. business is done, or felt like I had a good insight onto it. And the sale and exchange of data is quite wide open down there and much different than the Canadian experience. I don't think the American one is necessarily healthy, but that's what they do. And then the little anecdote I was going to point out is 2 weekends ago, I watched I, Tonya with my kids. And I'd never seen it before. It's a good movie, and it's about Tonya Harding's story and all that type of stuff. The mother is delightful in it. And so we got curious, was she still alive? She is still alive. And we found her address, her home phone number, her mobile number, and 2 email addresses she uses. Basically off of a Google search. I wasn't doing dark web things or nothing like that. You can't do that in Canada. There's a PAPITA and other various legislations help prevent that. But the ability to mine data in the United States is a powerful enabler. I can understand the logic there, but it also is kind of alarming. I'm not even getting into the Patriot Act and all the other stuff, but just even the core, how they access data and how they do it. So I think there could be a role emerging in Canada or for the various leaders around this public good. And it's about the privacy of the information, and it's about the trust in the system. When I come to purchase a house or buy a business or sell a business, if I say I'm Jeff King, I really am Jeff King.
Yeah.
And if I say there's X amount of dollars for a down payment, there really is that money there.
Yeah. And
all those things. I think it's incumbent on the industry to react very assertively on this. And that includes kicking bad actors out, by the way. But be very assertive about it. And I think the various digital tools can help us be much better around these things than what has historically happened. We've all seen stuff pulled from the headlines as recently as the last month or so of things happening in Canada that have been untoward towards the industry, and we have to move quickly to adapt to that. But our industry is not immune. You know, banks have had similar challenges. Law firms have had challenges. There's other professionals that they're in this, and I think we're at the precipice of a major shift towards how these things will work in society. And if I look with a longer lens at 2035, how is business transacted? Not just real estate, just in general.
Yeah.
I think it's going to have some of the same look and feel, but it's going to be dramatically different underneath the hood.
And so what I'm wondering, I mean, I have two things I want to get at, so I'm going to say them both so I don't forget. How do we go from identifying some of the challenges and actually making change? And maybe that speaks to my second part, is like, what has been sort of getting in the way? Why haven't we been able to progress in some industries the way we think we should have maybe been able to?
Sure. Okay. So the first part is that generally, we'll just talk sort of in the general sense, but this applies to real estate, but also banking and automotive. In a general sense, it kind of works, right? People are able to transact, they're able to do things.
It's not broken.
It's not broken. If I want to go buy a Toyota Corolla, I know where to go, and it's likely going to be a Toyota dealer and all that type of stuff. And so there's an inertia and a resistance to change that's kind of built into the system, because it's not literally the burning platform like, oh my goodness, we have to do something. That is part of it. The other part is that it's expensive to change at times. And if you look more closely at real estate, an area where I'm more familiar, the role of the managing broker is extremely challenging. You know, low margin, high risk, a lot of demands. The idea of leaning in on a major expenditure, just not in the economic model. It's not built around that. And so it becomes incumbent on the industry to find different ways to try to streamline it. I think that's probably part of the solution, is streamlining how we interact all these different things. There are tremendous transactional frictional costs, as Warren Buffett would call them. A lot of people with hands and parts into it, a lot of intermediaries touching and moving things around.
Human error,
the bad actors, just mistakes. I forgot. What all those things are in there. I think the industry and GVR is proud to play a role in to try to move the whole industry forward on this front. I think if we can find ways to streamline that, lower the probabilities for these things to happen, I think that'll help the entire industry. It'll help consumer confidence in it. It will help with confidence with the people doing individual transactions, but also in the greater sense of it. But we have to find ways to sort of become more efficient and more streamlined in how we provide services, both realtors and associations and bankers and other associated professions. Lawyers are kind of the most obvious one. We have to improve that. If we do that, I think we can free up the appropriate capital to continue to do these types of investments to make the transaction that much more seamless and easier. You know, when I look at, I was recently on a panel with some other industries that had gone through disruption, and one was automotive, and they talked about the pressure of having dealers versus not having dealers. And the person was a senior executive at a brand name car manufacturer. And their dealers take a percentage of the profit. And if there's something goes wrong, the dealer does something that's not appropriate, the manufacturer pays the price often for bad behavior. But they're competing with companies that do not have a dealership model. They're direct to consumer. And those ones use it to their advantage. So the Rivians and Teslas and Polestars and or short time Ocean Fisker, I guess, and all those, we're doing those types of things. That's definitely caught the attention of the large auto manufacturers who are realizing that the model may need adjustment. And that struck me as an industry that's not dissimilar to what real estate's going through, and frankly, kind of similar to what music went through a generation ago. Before, you needed a label and a publisher to get something out. Yeah. Then all of a sudden, there was TuneCore and CD Baby And next thing you know, there's YouTube and ultimately Spotify and different things like that, where you can just feed stuff up on your own.
Yeah.
So you end up having 100,000 songs a day being loaded up on platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And the old machinery couldn't handle that. It wouldn't handle it because the mathematics wouldn't make sense. But the consumer was empowered, and guess what? They're undefeated. So they started loading their own stuff, and we're getting discovered their own way. And so there's a lot of parallels. This is it's not identical, but there's a lot of parallels. This industry is more regulated than most, certainly than some of the other ones we've talked about. But they have their own issues, Canadian content laws and things like that. So I'm bullish about the future. I'm bullish about the Canadian future, but I'd like to think I'm not naive. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be some severe challenges, and the forward thinkers, the innovators, will be the ones that'll be able to soar power us through this.
So one of the things I'm wondering about is around culture of innovation. So whether that's within a business, an organization, even an entire industry, particularly when there's a lot of senior folks who, by senior, I mean experienced people who've been around a long time, might be looking at retirement in the next 5 years. So their incentive to change things up dramatically might be different than the next generations. And so I'm just wondering, you've now been in this role for a good few years, and you've been able to interact with some of the folks, across the country. What are your thoughts around building and nurturing a culture of innovation that can actually make decisions, take action, and move things forward?
It's a great question. So I've probably met 3,500 or so realtors since I took the job about 4 years ago. Vast majority are Vancouver GVR members, of course. But having said that, I find that their emotional intelligence, the traditional EQ, is off the charts. Probably the highest I've ever seen in any industry. That includes musicians and other professions like law and bankers and such. It's not shocking when you think about it. They're good at reading people. They're generally well attuned to how they're coming across. Not always, but generally they are. So that part makes me optimistic that we can sort of figure out how to continue to evolve. But there's generally a very tactical nature for realtors. A good friend of mine always says, see problem, fix problem, next problem is generally a realtor or managing broker mantra. He's not wrong. There is a lot of that, and it becomes very transactional because that's how you live. You eat what you kill, and all those different elements of it. And by doing that, almost by definition, becomes very short-sighted. Becomes, I'm worried about these 7 deals in front of me, one of which might happen. And so with that transactional type focus, it slows things down. And it makes other things sound scarier. And I don't have time to think about it, or I don't want to think about it. The high EQ, the emotional side of it, lends people to be open to talking about it, but actually doing it is harder. And so I think a big part of my role and the role of GVR is to help people become more comfortable with it. Part of it's change management, of course. You can't just say, here, deal with this. But have an acceptance and an understanding that things are changing, that GVR and frankly the regulator and BCRA and CREA and other stakeholders are looking to try to move the industry forward together and to do what's best for everyone, including the public. I'm optimistic that the EQ and the transition, as people begin to shift, more digital natives arriving in the industry, I think will be a good thing. We're starting to see a rise in them in the last little while. So people born in the late 90s type of deal becoming agents. I think their ability to adapt and lean on the tools will help move the industry rapidly and be ready for when that seismic shift happens. But until we get to that stage where they're at least a significant proportion of the audience, we're going to have different things where we help guide people through these changes in a way that feels good. We've had some products that we've released, Payload, which is basically electronic funds transfer tool. It's been extremely well received, and people are adapting to it extremely fast. And it's a key pillar, really, of what this sort of digital transaction will look like. But other parts have been, people have been very reluctant or anxious about it, using AI to identify photographs and such. So we built out what's one of the largest AI photo tools in real estate by feeding them through our recipe.ai program and to help identify different things. I know for some members it's alarming, and in the early days there was a lot of mistakes and hallucinations, or hey, there's a heater in the floor, and but AI learns like a child, and as it goes on, it improves at a rapid pace and begins to evolve. In a previous life, when I was at SOCAN, we did a lot of work with IBM and Watson, including a couple of hackathons and things like that, and I became close to some of their senior people. And they were telling me a story that they wanted to test Watson before it went on Jeopardy and to try to learn more. And so they turned Watson loose on Facebook and said, tell me everything about dogs, and gave it a few days to do it. Partway through, opened it up, asked some questions. And at that time, Watson was drawn to the conclusion that dogs were a little humans because it was pulling off of Facebook. It was scraping Facebook. And mostly. And they're saying, oh, look at my baby, look at her cute little hat, or look at my little fella, he's got his boots on, things like that. By the time the few weeks or a couple of weeks were over, it had mapped out the canine genome to the going back tens of thousands of years, including another a variant of wolf, not the wolves that exist today, but a different wolf that evolved into domesticated dogs. But it learned super quickly. So if you look at it in the first couple of weeks and it says, oh, they think it's little humans, well, that's kind of what happened like with some of the real estate stuff in the first 2 or 3 days. By the end of the first week, it was getting much better about identifying it. I bring that up because could be a powerful search tool for people to look for houses. I really want to have a marble island, or I really like the idea of stainless steel counters, whatever someone's into. And instead of going through 1,500 listings or 15,000 listings in the case of Vancouver, it would pull them out and say, oh, here's the 7 that match, that type of thing, or a dual garage door, south facing, who knows what. We need AI to sort of pull all those together. We don't have the financial model to have an army of people going through to try to identify those types of things. Those types of shifts are happening behind the scenes, and they will enable the further evolution of the industry. But moving the industry forward, especially with a seasoned demographic, we have to move gingerly with a lot of change management, a lot of explanation of what's going on, and a lot of connecting the dots why it's important. And then at the end of the day, it's almost like the old mantra, I'm going to tell you what I told you, I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to remind you what I told you, to help people feel more and more comfortable with it. Knowing that for realtors in Canada, there's give or take 150, 160,000. 15, 16,000 are going to be incredibly early adopters. 15, 16,000 would wish we would go back to quill and paper. And then there's that huge middle swath that are going to come along. But a big part of leaders within the industry will be helping move people to have within comfort and start to move towards the speed of business. The speed of business to me really means it's limited by how fast the ecosystem can handle. There's a speed of light, but it generally cannot be exceeded. There's a speed of business. And I think organized real estate struggled with that over the years, but we are moving faster and at a better clip. I've even noticed a change in the 4 years I've been here. Things are beginning to evolve. And I'm excited about what it looks like in 2030.
If you're speaking to business owners who are thinking about where their business might go, so let's take it out of real estate for a moment. But folks who maybe own or run a small to mid-sized business, and they're thinking about their consumers changing, the expectations of the public are changing. They know that XYZ competitor is trying out AI or whatever, finding new efficiencies, new ways of reaching their consumer, direct to consumer, you mentioned. There's so many stakeholders involved in business, whether it's, your employees, whether it's your spouse relying on you as a business owner, whether it's your customers or your community of businesses that you connect with. Do you have thoughts on how to decide when to make change and when to take risk?
Okay, yeah. Well, it depends on the person and depends on your own tolerance for risk, of course. But I do kind of believe deep down there are some warning signs and some things where people will pick up on maybe it's time, or maybe things are moving too fast, too far, and beyond the person or the team's ability to deal with it. You hit on a couple of the really big ones, like the direct-to-consumer thing. I know we touched on one of the earlier ones, but you see the rise of Amazon and Facebook Marketplace and Etsy and Pinterest and all that type of thing, and eBay naturally. That's been a huge shift, right? And you look at some specific different retail like organizations that they had to have the corner store, they had to have a store in the mall or something like that. They've been supplanted by digital online stores. And in that space, we're seeing a rise of companies that are looking to do and change search so you can search through the stores faster and better. I think embracing those types of things are important. So if you think you're falling behind, you probably are. If you feel like the pace of change is happening quickly and you're not ready for it, my free advice would be surround yourself with people that are comfortable with the space, not just the digital, but just in terms of the relationship with your employees and with your customers and with competitors, all those types of things, and someone to help navigate through it. Especially, most businesses have some intrinsic value, either repeat customers or even, the leads, so to speak. All those things have value that are trapped in there. And when you look at companies that sort of fizzle out, they lose track of that and they kind of lose the plot. But I think there is a transformation happening. In a lot of ways, it's a lot of opportunity. The digitization of a lot of these things. I can live in Abbotsford and I can sell my car parts anywhere in the world and all that type of stuff. It's amazing. It also means competitors are everywhere, which is also a challenge. And it also means that if you look at the really macro picture, the stratification, what's happening, particularly in the West, but everywhere, is dramatic. So we're seeing a few very large companies begin to really dominate a number of different things. Mm-hmm. Right. And it goes from, the whole like selling physical products, that's changing quickly. Access to the Chinese market's one thing, but one thing, the flip side, the Chinese manufacturers having access to North America or Western Europe is a complete game changer. There's some bits of it, of course. You can go to Walmart, 80% of the stuff's from China, but you can't buy many Chinese cars yet. And things like that. But those things are starting to emerge. On the entertainment space, Disney's turned into a quasi-monopoly in a lot of things, owns tons of intellectual property. In some ways, could be at risk of a takeover themselves, right, by one of the other tech giants. There's, the FANG companies have balance sheets strong enough that they could maybe say, we could use all that content. And that may not be a great thing for society if it gets overly concentrated in an oligarch type situation. Yeah, we're going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but there's lots of opportunities. It goes, from the corner store to large media players. But I think being mindful of it. If I always sort of subscribe, if you're not growing, you're dying. Yeah, and it doesn't just mean economic growth or things like that. I think it really means about learning. And so if people are obsessed on learning and trying to find out new things that are happening, being well aware of what's going on in their industry and competitors, I think that can be extremely telling. I'm in a couple of peer groups with other CEOs. I'm in two main ones, and between the two of them, there's a couple of dozen CEOs, variety of from manufacturing to financial services to professional services to you name it. There's a few consistent themes. And it's a rise of an omnipotent competitor that's incredibly well financed. It's the hard to get skilled people. It's the scaling challenges. Scaling is kind of your friend, and it's the constant change. And it doesn't matter if you're making car parts in Southern Ontario or if you're doing real estate in Northern BC. These seem to be consistent themes. They're just being felt in different ways. And so I think really paying close attention to a lot of these macro things and thinking long-term can be really helpful to your industry. One of my things I'd like to do with people I work with is like, if you were going to be disrupted, how would you disrupt yourself? Mm-hmm. If something happened and you had to run a competitor across the street to take your business out, what would you zero in on? Oh, we're not great at this. Or I wish our balance sheet was stronger. We're cash flow restrained. Whatever the topic is, I then work to identify those types of things. And I think a lot of companies don't spend the time on that. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity ends up sort of morphing and evolving, including big ones, right? So I'm in the process of sort of putting together a bit of a book around companies that innovate and they innovate and they innovate and they innovate, and then all of a sudden they stop. And then they just start refining the rock that they created and fine tune it and become like supply chain machines or whatever it is. And I'm very curious why that happens. So sometimes I wonder if it's a cult of personality and a key leader left, or if they just got comfortable and became too bureaucratic, or they felt they were too big to fail and the machine just sort of paused. So they need a jolt of something to wake them up. And so I'm working through this kind of premise. But I think there's a thread there, Ashley, around that. And that goes from very small businesses to some of the biggest, most valuable companies the earth has ever seen. 15 years ago or 10 years ago, someone would have said, Google's dominance of search will be challenged and search will look much different by 2030. Most people would have said, you're insane.
Yeah.
Right. Bing showed up and plays on the periphery, and it was mostly because it's a default, built-in device or built-in search. But now we are actually seeing a change in search, the rise of AI and people using LLMs and GPT type models to start to evolve this. I think I'm not a technician, I'm not an engineer like that, but if a layperson like I can see, this is going to change search forever, I'm sure Google's seen it, and they've got to figure out new ways to sort of approach these things. And that goes, I think, for all of us.
And that sort of brings me, I think, to the final thing I'm hoping we can unpack a tiny bit. And maybe we can leave the audience with some granular sort of specific advice. But let's get back to this idea that you were brought in from a completely different sector to lead a really important maybe I'm biased, but really important organization, but in a very important part of the economy in
Absolutely.
British Columbia.
Yeah.
And, you mention hackathons, you mention collaboration, you mention different groups, peer groups that you have of folks who are from across different industries. So, I know that when you were hired, it was a priority to look beyond what we traditionally knew in terms of leadership, because we knew there was things coming and there's change needed to be made and we needed a new perspective. But I think that ties in, with growth and even to your point, businesses that have done a lot of wonderful things, but now what's next and how do we see around those corners? So if there's anything you'd like to leave the audience with around either experimentation outside of industry or collaboration. And then the granular thing I'm hoping to touch on is if there are specific groups or types of organizations or types of opportunities for Canadians to be able to look for that they may not be aware of in terms of how to get better in touch with peers.
I'll try to hit as many as possible. So on the first part about different ways of working at different things, I think you're quite right. And I think organized real estate's a good example. People kept to their own individual silos, almost essentially geographically based, frankly, and handled different catchments, almost like school boards. It worked well for a long time. But as the realtors listening to the pod will know, it's a provincial license. And BC is not unique that way. Most provinces handle it this way. Most U.S. states handle it this way. And the idea that, on one side of the river, it's this way, and the other side of the river, it's that way, or on this side of the highway, it's X, and this side of the highway, it's Y. I think those days are probably almost gone. And so when we talked a little bit earlier on about the EQ, the emotional intelligence, that's a big part about it, and being self-aware. Another part about there's really, to me, three big pillars around successful leaders: EQ, IQ, regular intelligence, and then SQ, social quotient, and the ability to connect and be that connector amongst things. And I think organized real estate and other industries are starting to learn, and this has been particularly true. We've seen in Canada since the Trump inauguration. And the first time 51st state came out of his mouth, I think Canadian leaders from all different stripes and all different parts of the political and economic spectrum started to realize this is different. We began to really lean in on the SQ, the social quotient, and began to talk to each other in different ways. And that includes for organized real estate. So GVR and myself personally, we've always been working hard to build stronger relationships with other partners within BC, but frankly across the country and also in the United States. And I think I want that to continue to accelerate and continue to keep moving along as we go along. I think there's efficiency to be gained. I think there's new ways to look at problems. If you're great at something, Ashley, and I'm great at something, maybe together we do something better. The analogy I always use is like the Reese's peanut butter cups. You make great peanut butter. I make great chocolate. Why don't we do something different? That doesn't exist until we work together. And I think those types of things are starting to emerge in discussions, including new and different relationships. Where GVR is working very closely with LTSA, the Land Title Survey Agency of British Columbia. And I think there's some interesting opportunities there to connect a couple of dots and loose strings that were operating on their own little silos. Something could be more efficient with greater transparency and the like. The second two parts of your question around where can people pick up different things and learn. Everyone learns in a different way. I find podcasts and reading to be quite beneficial. Other people are more social and they like to have different connectivities. And I think they all work. I think as long as you have a growth mindset and you're able to look at these types of things. But I'm happy to give a shout out to the peer groups I'm in.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I'll list them if that's appropriate.
Yeah, totally appropriate. I'm sure they'll appreciate it, and I'll get a lunch out of it. So one of them is McKay CEO Forums, which is headquartered in Vancouver but operates nationally, and I'm part of a Toronto chapter for that. And another one is Innovators Alliance, which was originally started by the Ontario government a generation ago in the late 90s, early 2000s or so, and is really focused on innovation and looks to try to move things forward along those lines. They're much different. They're similar in the case that they're peer groups, but they're much different in the nature of who they represent, who they attract, and the approach that they have. So I find I get a lot out of both of them. And I thoroughly enjoy it. And I've got great respect for the people I've met through there. And I'd like to think I've given back some good things to them as well. But connected to that, I would, I lean in a lot on TED Talks. I lean in a lot on different areas to learn. I'll sit in on to hear what different professors and thought leaders are doing. There's some great podcasts around the future of work. There's Simon Sinek types and Scott Galloway's are well known. But there's also some lesser known ones that have some creative thoughts on how different things can be approached and new ways for industry. So I encourage everyone to have an open mind to how they want to attach these things and kind of view it as your way of getting your own instincts around your own business and how it's evolving and when the right time is. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised what thoughts get connected all of a sudden. And I just connected a couple of people a week or so ago, and I was at a mutual friend and organized a dinner, and I met a private equity person who was looking to do something. And it was right in alignment with something that a friend of mine who's in one of these peer groups was looking to do. And I thought, okay, so I played matchmaker and connected those two. I think the connectivity in the industry from all aspects is going to accelerate dramatically. And that's kind of like hive opportunity that we're all in this together and we're working these things together. It's being hyped up by the current U.S. administration, but I think a lot of that will stick for a while. New relationships are being built. And I think that type of mindset will help Canada sort of longer term as we morph and move along on these types of things. And then another area, the final part, unusual sort of fishing holes to look at, you might say, younger people. When I talk to people, when I do, I'm on a podcast or when I'm talking to university students and such, and when they always ask about music, they ask about real estate. On the music front, I always say, where do you hear your music and where do you find out? The vast majority of it now on the music side is TikTok and YouTube by a mile. Mm-hmm. On the real estate thing, after you get the usual, I'll never afford a house or I can't even afford rent discussion, which is an issue. And I think Canada's got to come to grips with these things. But it's interesting, the MLS or realtors or realtor.ca are not top of mind for these people. They go on Facebook Marketplace. They'll go into different social groups. They'll do different things like that to sort of piece things together. It doesn't mean that's all going to end up there, but these are digital natives. They only know a world where the internet existed. And so they're going to have a different view of it. And so I keep that in the back of my mind when we look at and we start to model out and I mean royal we, organized real estate, GVR and VCRA and CREA and the Law Society, everybody else. When we look at different ways how this could look, I want something that's going to be engaging to this because we want to have the trust and the security of these types of transactions. Sooner than we think, we're going to see the silver tsunami is going to start. Yeah. I think it's already started, if you want my honest opinion. Yeah. And so for those who are maybe unfamiliar with the term, it's basically the people in the boomers, for lack of a better word, in their 60s or 70s who are selling their businesses or moving to a smaller home or passing on, and they're children are this massive transfer of wealth, largest transfer of wealth in human history is already started. That's going to mean a flow of capital that's unprecedented. Doesn't mean it's going to be sunshine and easy, because it also means competition, but you want to be able to have a system in terms of whatever your business is, or real estate in the case of on these types of things. You want to have a system that's well built and adapted to this. People who have that figured out will be that much more ahead of the game. And so that 2030, which it's basically here, when we're shooting this, it's right at the end of September. We're 3 months away from 2026. It's kind of mind blowing.
It is.
Like, we're closer to 2050 than we are to the year 2000.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So it's the pace just seems to be accelerating. And so I think the folks and the business leaders that are thinking about these types of things in their business will be well served, or they'll be subject to acquisition.
That could lead into a whole other conversation, but I think we're going to have to leave it for another day. So, but it does leave me thinking we will have to schedule a part 2
Happy
at some point.
to come back. We can talk about alternate currencies and whatever you want.
Oh gosh, I know we didn't even deep dive on that.
Yeah.
Jeff, thank you so much for being here on Canada Now. I think you've laid a really great foundation for our audience in an early episode. And I think you've touched on a lot of the reasons why I think it's interesting to talk about business, real estate, innovation, the future of work, all from a Canadian lens, because these things are all in many ways tied together and touching Canadians every day, I think, in many ways. So
yeah.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I hope everyone enjoyed this episode of Canada Now. I will be leaving some information on Jeff and some of the things he referenced in the show notes. So look there, and I'll probably get a list of some of your favorite podcasts too.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on. It was great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.